refilled coffee cups, walks beside the lake, conversations where old fears surfaced, and instead of retreating, they stayed. They listened. They chose each other again and again. Months later, standing by the lake beneath a wide-open sky, Eleanor realized something remarkable. Love had not returned to her life in a dramatic rush. It had grown quietly, like roots beneath the soil. Strong, steady, real. And Daniel realized something too. Success no longer felt like a title or a salary. Success felt like staying. Like building something meaningful with someone who saw him clearly. What began as a simple glance across a quiet street had become something lasting. Not perfect, but real. And as they looked toward a future still unwritten, they understood something powerful. Love, when chosen with courage, does not take away freedom. It gives it meaning. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share so more people can discover meaningful stories like this one. And remember, sometimes the most important moments in life begin quietly, with nothing more than a stranger, a smile, and the courage to stay. Whenever life demanded emotional depth, he chose distance. He had always told himself that was wisdom. But maybe it was just fear. On the morning he had to give his final answer, Daniel didn't sleep. At sunrise, he walked quickly through the quiet streets until he reached Eleanor's house. He knocked. When she opened the door, he spoke before doubt could stop him. "I've spent most of my life running when things started to matter," he said. "I came here to hide, and instead I found you." He paused, swallowing the nervous weight in his chest. "I don't want to choose fear again." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "I'm afraid too," she admitted. "Afraid of losing this. Afraid of never trying," he said. They stood there in the soft morning light. No dramatic music. No cinematic moment. Just two people making a quiet decision. Daniel declined the offer in Seattle. Not recklessly. Not impulsively. But intentionally. Love didn't explode into fireworks. It grew slowly. Shared mornings. But the silence that followed suggested something important. Safety and living were not the same thing. Weeks later, Daniel received a phone call. Seattle. His former boss offered him a promotion. More money. More responsibility. A position many people would consider impossible to refuse. For 2 days he didn't tell Eleanor. But she sensed the change. Distance doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. Finally, during a walk by the lake at sunset, she asked quietly, "Are you leaving?" Daniel stopped walking. "I don't know," he said honestly. And somehow those words hurt more than a simple yes. Because uncertainty felt painfully familiar to her. Like the early days when her marriage had begun to unravel. "I came here to breathe," Daniel said. "But Seattle was my life." Eleanor looked out across the water. "And what is this?" she asked softly. Daniel didn't have an answer. For several days, they gave each other space. Eleanor returned to her routines. But something had changed. The quiet no longer felt comforting. It felt empty. Daniel walked through town alone, wrestling with a realization he had avoided his entire life. Whenever something meaningful appeared, he stepped away. About a career that looked impressive, but drained the color from his life. One evening he said quietly, "We loved each other, but love wasn't enough to make us want the same future." Eleanor understood that sentence more than she wanted to admit. Eventually she shared her own story. The slow fading of her marriage. The quiet loneliness of feeling unseen. "I decided peace was safer than hope," she told him one evening. Daniel looked at her thoughtfully. "Is it?" he asked gently. Eleanor didn't answer. Because she wasn't sure anymore. Then one evening the storm came. Dark clouds rolled over the lake late in the afternoon. By nightfall, wind whipped across the water and rain pounded rooftops with sudden intensity. The power went out across their entire street. Inside her house, Eleanor stood in darkness. The silence felt enormous. Then there was a knock at the door. She hesitated before opening it. Daniel stood outside, rain dripping from his jacket. In one hand he held a flashlight. In the other, 2 steaming mugs. "I thought you might need some light," he said. "And coffee." No pressure. No expectation. Just presence. She let him in. They sat together on the covered porch wrapped in blankets. listening to the rain drumming against wood and metal. In the darkness, the world felt smaller, more honest. After a long silence, Daniel spoke. "I'm scared to trust something again," he admitted quietly. "Starting over feels brave, but also terrifying." Eleanor watched the rain fall across the lake. "I trained myself not to want too much," she said softly. "Wanting makes you vulnerable." "And not wanting?" he asked. She thought for a moment. "It keeps you safe." Daniel didn't argue. Cities rarely moved this slowly. Yet even while he unpacked boxes and thanked friendly strangers, his attention drifted back toward the house across the street. The pale blue shutters. The tidy porch. The woman who carried herself with quiet composure and tired eyes that hinted at stories she did not easily share. Meanwhile, Eleanor spent her day at work trying to focus. But her thoughts kept drifting. She felt irritated with herself for noticing him. New people meant change. And change meant disruption. And disruption often led to pain. She had spent years building a life that avoided emotional risk. So why did the memory of his quiet smile linger in her mind? Days passed. Then greetings began. Short ones at first. "Good morning." "Cold today." "Still unpacking." Simple words exchanged beside mailboxes or across driveways. But gradually, the conversations became longer. And Eleanor noticed something unusual about Daniel. He listened. Really listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't steer conversations back toward himself. He didn't rush to give advice. He simply paid attention. It had been a long time since someone had done that for her. Daniel, in turn, noticed the careful way Eleanor spoke. She chose words thoughtfully, as if language carried weight, as if careless sentences could leave bruises. One evening, they ended up walking near the lake together. The water mirrored the sky so perfectly it felt like the world had doubled. Their conversations started with simple topics: books, weather, morning routines. But over time, the topics deepened naturally. Daniel told her about Seattle, about ambition turning into obligation. Because no one there expected him to perform. Because the lake, the trees, and the silence promised something his old life no longer offered. Stillness. He told himself that was enough. He did not expect anything else. Certainly not the woman standing across the street. When Eleanor stepped off her porch and locked the door behind her, Daniel looked up. Their eyes met. It lasted only a moment. But something paused inside both of them. Neither smiled immediately. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't uncomfortable. It felt more like recognition. The strange, quiet recognition that sometimes happens between two strangers before they understand why. Then Daniel offered a small, polite smile. Not charming. Not confident. Just genuine. Eleanor nodded politely and walked toward her car. She told herself the moment meant nothing. Just another neighbor. Just another new face. But as she pulled away from the curb and glanced into her rearview mirror, she noticed something. Daniel was still standing there, watching the street. Not staring at her. Just looking. As though a door somewhere in his life had opened quietly, and he wasn't yet sure what was behind it. Small towns move gently around newcomers. Within a few hours of arriving, Daniel had already met several neighbors. One offered directions to the nearest grocery store. Another recommended a bakery famous for sourdough bread. A retired couple from down the street stopped by with a homemade pie. The kindness surprised him. He had a prestigious job at a technology firm. An impressive title. A salary that made relatives proud and strangers impressed. From the outside, everything about his life suggested success. But success can be deceptive. Because what people saw on paper was not what Daniel felt every morning when he woke up. His work had slowly consumed him. Deadlines. Pressure. Meetings that seemed important but felt strangely empty. The excitement he once felt early in his career had gradually faded into exhaustion. And then there was the engagement. For 2 years, Daniel had been planning a future with a woman he genuinely cared about. They were kind to each other. Respectful. They shared history, memories, and mutual affection. But eventually they both realized something uncomfortable. Their dreams were not moving in the same direction. There had been no dramatic fight. Just long conversations. Honest ones. The kind where both people already know the truth before either one says it. Love, they discovered, was not always enough to build the same life. So they ended the engagement gently. And after that, Daniel stayed in Seattle longer than he should have. Partly out of habit, partly out of fear, but mostly because leaving meant admitting something difficult. The life he had built no longer felt like home. Eventually, the exhaustion won. He packed his belongings, quit his job, and drove across the country in search of something he couldn't quite name. Peace, maybe, or simply a quieter place to breathe. He chose Vermont because it was small. Eleanor finished her coffee, rinsed the mug, and moved through her morning routine with the quiet precision she had developed over time. Check the stove, turn off the hallway light, grab her coat, lock the back door. Everything exactly the same as yesterday, and the day before, and the week before that. But when she opened the front door, the cold morning air brushed against her face sharply. She stepped onto the porch, and that's when she saw it. Across the street, a large white moving truck sat parked beside the empty house that had been on the market for months. Its engine was silent now, but the presence of the truck felt loud against the quiet neighborhood. Next to it stood a man holding a cardboard box against his chest. He looked tall, but not intimidating. Just steady. His dark hair was slightly messy from travel, and his posture carried a kind of careful uncertainty, as though he were stepping into a place that didn't yet feel familiar. He glanced around slowly, studying the street like someone trying to understand a new language. This was Daniel Carter, and he had arrived before sunrise. Daniel had not slept much the night before. The drive from Seattle to Vermont had been long, thousands of miles stretching across highways, cities, and landscapes that blurred together over days of travel. But the distance had not only been physical, it had been emotional too. In Seattle, Daniel had built the kind of life people admired. 3 years earlier, her marriage had ended, not with shouting, not with slammed doors or shattered glass. There had been no dramatic confrontation, just distance. Slow, quiet distance. The kind that grows so gradually you don't notice it until one day you realize the person sitting across the table from you feels like a stranger. Her ex-husband had not been cruel. In some ways, that made it harder. There had been no villain to blame, no single moment to point to and say, "That's when everything broke." Instead, their relationship dissolved like ink spreading in water. At first, it was only small changes, longer silences at dinner, conversations that felt forced, the absence of laughter that used to fill the room. Then eventually came the realization neither of them wanted to say out loud. They had grown apart. And somewhere along the way, Eleanor had begun to feel invisible. Not unloved, just unseen. So when the divorce finally came, Eleanor didn't collapse dramatically the way people expect heartbreak to look. Instead, she reorganized her life. Carefully, quietly. She built routines that felt safe. Predictable mornings. Simple evenings. Work, reading, long walks near the lake. No surprises. No emotional risks. Because Eleanor had learned something painful about hope. Hope could hurt. So she stopped expecting anything extraordinary. She convinced herself ordinary was enough. And for 3 years it was. Or at least she told herself it was. That morning, however, something felt slightly different. She couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the air. Maybe it was the silence. But something about the day felt heavier. Like the world was holding its breath. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the like button. Your support helps us share more powerful and unforgettable stories with people all around the world. And if you enjoy stories that unfold slowly, stories filled with real emotion and meaningful moments that stay with you long after the video ends, then you're exactly where you belong. This channel isn't just about storytelling for entertainment. It's about stories that feel real. Stories about people who struggle, grow, fall apart, and sometimes find their way back to something beautiful again. Today's story is not simply about romance. It's about timing. It's about courage. It's about the quiet moments where life asks you to decide whether you will protect your heart or finally allow it to live again. So take a deep breath, settle in, and let's begin. The morning arrived without ceremony. There was no dramatic sunrise blazing across the sky. No sudden interruption hinting that something unusual was about to begin. Instead, the day unfolded gently, the way many of life's most meaningful days do, quietly and without warning. In northern Vermont, the early light drifted across the lake like a thin layer of silver paint. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the pale sky so clearly that it almost felt as though the world had doubled. Mist hovered just above the surface. Everything looked calm, almost suspended. Inside a modest lakeside home, Eleanor Brooks stood alone in her kitchen. She wrapped both hands around a warm ceramic mug, letting the heat sink into her palms. Steam curled upward in soft spirals, disappearing into the quiet air. But she didn't drink yet. Instead, she simply stared through the window at the lake beyond her backyard. Eleanor had become very good at stillness.